Her fiancé flew in from New York, and her family travelled over from California to help with the search. Annie's odd disappearance quickly became big news. Reporters were all over the campus, and over 100 law enforcement officers joined the search too.
Annie Lou was born on July 3, 1985, in San Jose, California, into a family that carried both the pride and the burden of the immigrant story. Her parents had fled Vietnam years earlier, carrying with them the memory of hardship and the determination to build a better life for their children in America. Like so many families who arrived with little but hope, they settled in a modest community and worked tirelessly to make ends meet. Annie, the youngest of 5, grew up surrounded by siblings who each bore the marks of sacrifice: long hours, low-paying jobs, constant emphasis on education as the ladder out of struggle. From the very beginning, Annie's spark set her apart. She was small in stature, barely over 5 feet tall even as an adult, but what she lacked in size she made up for in brilliance and determination. Her eyes lit with curiosity, her voice carried energy, and her mind seemed always in motion. Teachers noticed her quick grasp of concepts, her hunger to excel, and her unshakable focus on goals. She wasn't just another bright student. She was relentless. Her family, though not wealthy, encouraged her ambitions. They reminded her often that education was both privilege and responsibility. Annie understood. She pushed herself harder than anyone had to push her. In elementary school, she was the child who stayed after class to ask questions, who volunteered for extra assignments, who helped classmates struggling to keep up. She wasn't arrogant, far from it. She carried her gifts with humility, aware that every opportunity she had was born from the sacrifices her parents had made before her. As she moved into middle and high school, Annie's discipline only deepened. She excelled in math and science, subjects that intimidated many of her peers. She joined clubs, volunteered in labs, immersed herself in study. She didn't coast on natural intelligence. She worked for every grade, every accolade. Friends remembered her as someone who balanced academic seriousness with warmth and humor. She could spend hours buried in textbooks and then break out into laughter with friends, cracking jokes, radiating positivity. She had a seriousness of purpose, but not the heaviness of ego to be. By the time Annie reached high school, it was clear she was bound for elite institutions. She won awards, scholarships, recognition. Teachers spoke of her in glowing terms, predicting she would one day make a mark in science or medicine. But Annie wasn't only defined by intellect. She loved fashion, had a keen eye for style, and often appeared in neatly chosen outfits that expressed both personality and professionalism. Even in her teenage years, she carried herself with a mix of charm and precision, a young woman who knew how she wanted to be seen and wasn't afraid to put in the effort to achieve it. She was also deeply close to her family. Though she had ambitions that stretched far beyond San Jose, she never forgot the roots that shaped her. She remained loyal to her siblings, grateful for her parents' sacrifices, attentive to the traditions of her culture. For Annie, success wasn't only about personal achievement. It was about honoring the family who had given her the chance to pursue it. When she graduated high school in 2003, Annie was at the top of her class, armed with scholarships and a resume of achievements that opened doors. She applied ambitiously, setting her sights on Ivy League schools and top universities. Cornell University in Ithaca, New York, accepted her, and it became the next stage of her journey. For her parents, sending their daughter across the country was bittersweet. Pride and worry mingled as they hugged her goodbye. For Annie, it was exhilarating, a chance to step into a wider world, to test herself against the brightest minds in the nation. At Cornell, Annie thrived. The campus, with its sprawling quads, libraries, and laboratories, became her playground. She majored in biochemistry and quickly made a name for herself as a rising scholar. Professors praised her diligence, her insights, her capacity for research. She was the student who arrived early, stayed late, and absorbed material with a hunger that set her apart. Cornell also gave Annie the space to blossom socially. She developed a circle of friends, many of whom admired not only her intelligence but her energy and kindness. She loved to dance, to dress stylishly, to laugh over late-night conversations. She balanced her grueling coursework with joy, never allowing the weight of ambition to smother the lightness of living. Her roommates recalled how she decorated their shared spaces with splashes of color, how she encouraged them during stressful times, how she seemed to radiate calm even in the storm of exams. It was at Cornell that Annie met Jonathan Witkowski, a fellow student who studied physics. Jonathan was quiet, thoughtful, steady, a man whose calm complemented Annie's intensity. Their relationship grew slowly, built on shared respect and intellectual companionship. He admired her drive, her laughter, her unwavering sense of purpose. She admired his stability, his gentleness, the way he anchored her when her ambitions threatened to overwhelm. By their senior year, the two were inseparable, and though careers and graduate school loomed ahead, they made it clear they would face the future together. After graduating Cornell in 2007, Annie's ambitions pulled her to Yale University in New Haven, Connecticut, where she began a PhD program in pharmacology. Yale represented the pinnacle of her dreams, an Ivy League institution where she could conduct cutting-edge research, where she could contribute to the field of medicine in ways that might one day save lives. Her focus was cancer research, an area of study that combined her fascination with biochemistry and her desire to do work with profound human impact. At Yale, Annie quickly impressed both peers and professors. Her research was meticulous, her questions probing, her work ethic unmatched. In the laboratory, she was precise, methodical, always aware of safety protocols, always diligent in documentation. Outside of it, she was warm, approachable, often described as the kind of person you wanted on your team. She brought energy and optimism to the most grueling of projects, lifting those around her with her determination. Jonathan, meanwhile, had remained in New York, pursuing his own graduate studies in physics. The distance was challenging, but their bond only grew. They visited each other on weekends, filled their days with calls and emails, made plans for the future. In 2008, Jonathan proposed, and Annie said yes with joy. They set a wedding date for September 13, 2009, a Sunday in Syosset, New York. Annie, with her usual precision and style, dove into planning, balancing her research with dress fittings, guest lists, and all the small details that turned a day into a celebration. Her friends recalled her excitement, how she spoke with a smile about her gown, how she couldn't wait to walk down the aisle. By the summer of 2009, Annie seemed to be standing at the threshold of everything she had dreamed. She was engaged to a man she loved, immersed in research she was passionate about, and surrounded by friends and colleagues who admired her. At just 24, she was living proof of what hard work, resilience, and determination could achieve. But fate is cruel. Just days before the wedding she had so carefully planned, Annie would vanish into the walls of the very laboratory where she had poured her dreams, leaving behind a mystery that would horrify her family, her fiancé, her community, and the nation. By the fall of 2008 and into 2009, Annie Lee's world seemed to orbit in perfect balance. She was thriving at Yale, one of the most prestigious universities in the country, immersed in her PhD research in pharmacology. She was engaged to Jonathan Witkowski, her Cornell sweetheart, who was continuing his studies in physics at Columbia. Their love endured the challenges of distance, bridged by phone calls, emails, and weekend visits. She had a circle of friends and mentors who admired her drive and warmth, and she had a wedding date marked on the calendar, September 13, 2009. Her days in New Haven were demanding. The Yale School of Medicine's research labs were rigorous environments where long hours were the norm. Annie specialized in cancer-related pharmacology, working with mouse models, and studying complex biological processes that might one day pave the way for breakthroughs. She was often the first to arrive and one of the last to leave, slipping into her lab coat and gloves, her small frame moving with efficiency among the cages, equipment, and notebooks that defined her research. Colleagues admired not just her intelligence, but her discipline. In science, brilliance alone isn't enough. It takes precision, patience, and resilience to wade through failures and setbacks. Annie had all of that. She was methodical in her work, recording data with the detail of someone who understood that every entry could matter. Yet she was also approachable, quick to smile, eager to collaborate. Professors spoke of her as a student destined for impact, someone who could have become a leader in biomedical research. Outside of the lab, Annie had a lighter side. She loved fashion and often dressed stylishly even for long hours on campus. Her petite frame accented with carefully chosen outfits that reflected her personality. She read Vogue, loved heels, and once wrote an article for a campus magazine about how women could balance science and style, arguing that ambition and femininity weren't mutually exclusive. For Annie, dressing well wasn't vanity, it was part of the confidence she carried, an expression of identity alongside the lab coat. Her engagement to Jonathan was the centerpiece of her personal life. Friends remembered how she lit up when speaking about him, how she counted down the weeks and days until their wedding. They had chosen the North Ritz Club in Syosset, Long Island, a venue with glittering chandeliers and a reputation for elegance. Annie had already picked her dress, a gown that she described with giddy excitement to her friends, and she was meticulous with the details. She wanted the day to be perfect, a celebration of the love they had nurtured since Cornell.A.'s summer turned to September. The anticipation built. Annie's calendar was dotted with reminders, final dress fitting, travel arrangements for family, schedules for the ceremony. Her bridesmaids were ready. Her relatives were preparing to fly in. Jonathan's family was coordinating plans. Everything was coming together. For Annie, the wedding wasn't just an event. It was a symbol of survival, of triumph over hardship, of a future that stretched ahead in brilliance. In the final week before her wedding, Annie moved through New Haven with joy. She joked with lab colleagues about leaving soon for her honeymoon. She spoke to Jonathan often, their conversations full of excitement. Her friends noticed her happiness, the glow of someone about to step into a new chapter of life. She was only 24, yet she had achieved more than many twice her age, a prestigious program, a fiancé she adored, a family bursting with pride. But woven into her final days were threads of unease. The Yale research facility where she worked, a labyrinthine structure of stairwells, rooms, and sealed spaces, could be an isolating place. Security was tight, requiring ID card swipes to access different areas. Still, Annie occasionally mentioned feeling uneasy about some of the staff. It was the kind of vague discomfort that most people dismiss, the intuition you brush aside while focusing on your tasks. She never made formal complaints, never pointed to specific threats. To her, the lab was simply the place where she did her work, another step toward the future she was building. On the morning of Tuesday, September 8, 2009, Annie rose in her apartment in New Haven. She dressed with her usual care, slipping into professional attire despite the long hours of research ahead. She called Jonathan that morning, her voice bright, their conversation light. The wedding was just 5 days away. Soon, she would walk down the aisle, surrounded by family and friends, ready to start her life as Mrs. Widowski. That dream was so close she could almost taste it. She walked across the campus, her small frame moving with brisk confidence. Security cameras captured her entering the Yale Research Building at 10 Amistad Street around 10 a.m. She swiped her ID card to pass through secured doors, her hair neatly styled, her outfit immaculate as always. To any observer, she was just another graduate student beginning her day. But what no one knew in that moment was that Annie Lou was walking into her final hours. Within the walls of the building she trusted, in the very place where she had invested her dreams of a scientific future, danger awaited. Danger not from a stranger on the street, but from someone inside, someone she thought she could trust. When Annie failed to return home that evening, her friends grew anxious. Calls went unanswered. Messages went unread. Jonathan, waiting in New York and busy with final wedding preparations, tried reaching her too. Nothing. At first, they assumed she was buried in work, distracted by the stress of her upcoming wedding. But as the night wore on, worry deepened into dread. Annie Lou, the bride-to-be, the scientist, the daughter and sister and friend who never failed to keep her commitments, had vanished. Her disappearance would spark a frantic search that drew in police, the FBI, the national media, and the collective heartbreak of a community. And within days, the world would learn the horrifying truth. Annie Lou had never left the Yale Research Building alive. The first hours of Annie Lee's disappearance were defined by confusion. It wasn't unusual for a graduate student to spend long hours in the lab, buried in research until late into the night. But when Annie didn't return home on the evening of September 8th, 2009, her friends noticed something was wrong. Calls to her phone went unanswered, and messages piled up without response. Annie was meticulous about communication, especially so close to her wedding. She wasn't the kind of person to disappear without a word. Her fiancé, Jonathan Widowski, tried reaching her repeatedly. In New York, final preparations for their September 13th wedding were underway. He expected calls about details, about excitement, about the days ahead. Instead, he was met with silence. He alerted friends in New Haven, who confirmed she hadn't been seen leaving the Yale research building that morning. Concern quickly shifted into panic. By the following morning, September 9th, the Yale Police Department was alerted. Campus officers began making calls, retracing Annie's schedule, speaking with colleagues. They checked security footage, searching for her departure from the lab. To their shock, the cameras showed her entering the building at 10 Amistad Street, around 10 a.m., but no footage ever showed her leaving. This detail struck investigators immediately. The Yale lab was a secure facility, requiring ID badge access for each door. Every move was logged. Yet Annie's ID card showed no exit, no swipes after her arrival. It was as if she had walked into the building and vanished into thin air. The disappearance of a Yale student was not just a local concern. It quickly escalated to national attention. By September 10th, the FBI joined the investigation alongside the Connecticut State Police and New Haven detectives. Reporters swarmed New Haven, their cameras clustered outside the laboratory as images of Annie's smiling face filled television screens across the country. She wasn't just a graduate student. She was a bride-to-be, days away from her wedding. A brilliant young scientist whose future had been stolen in an instant. The story gripped the nation. Inside the lab, investigators began their painstaking search. The building itself was vast, a maze of laboratories, storage rooms, mechanical shafts, and hidden spaces. Teams combed through every corner, opening doors, searching closets, shining flashlights into ductwork. Dogs were brought in, their noses sniffing for traces of human scent. As they searched, Annie's loved ones clung to hope. Her family, devastated and bewildered, flew into New Haven, pleading for answers. Jonathan remained in New York, consumed with fear, his wedding plans now transformed into vigils and phone calls with investigators. Friends and colleagues gathered at vigils, holding candles, praying for her safe return. The story of Annie Lou. 24 years old, brilliant, beautiful, a woman of promise, captured hearts across the nation. But as each day passed, hope dimmed. Investigators began to suspect foul play. The possibility of Annie simply leaving voluntarily was ruled out quickly. Her belongings were untouched. Her phone, purse, and keys had been left behind. Her wedding was only days away. She would not have abandoned it. And the security system told the most chilling story of all. She had never left the building alive. On September 13th, the very day Annie was supposed to walk down the aisle in Syosset, New York, investigators made the devastating discovery. Behind a false wall in a mechanical room deep inside the laboratory, they found her body stuffed inside a chase, a vertical shaft used for utilities. She had been strangled and hidden, her small frame concealed in a space no one would have thought to look. The news broke like a shockwave. What should have been Annie's wedding day became the day her family received confirmation that she was gone. Instead of walking in her white gown down the aisle to meet Jonathan, her loved ones stood in silence, devastated by the brutality of her death. The images of joy that had surrounded her wedding plans, the dress, the flowers, the laughter, were replaced with headlines of horror. The discovery ignited grief and fury. Who could have committed such an act and why? Investigators focused immediately on those with access to the secure building. This was not a random crime. Annie's killer had to be someone with clearance, someone who knew the ins and outs of the facility, someone who could move unnoticed in its labyrinthine spaces. Suspicion quickly began to circle one man, Raymond Clark III, a 24-year-old Yale animal lab technician. He had access to the building, responsibility for the mice and animals used in research, and knowledge of its hidden spaces. More chillingly, his ID badge showed activity in areas near where Annie's body was found on the day she disappeared. The investigation that followed would unearth the darkness inside a man who had seemed ordinary, a young technician with a girlfriend, a life that outwardly appeared normal. But the evidence would reveal something far more sinister. Annie Lo had not fallen victim to a stranger. She had been murdered by someone inside her professional circle, a man whose duty had been to care for the research animals, but who had instead unleashed violence on a colleague. Her death shook Yale to its core. Vigils turned into memorials. Professors and students wept openly, devastated by the loss of one of their brightest. The laboratory was shut down, a crime scene marked by tape and police presence. National outlets carried the story for weeks, broadcasting Annie's face, her story, her unrealized future. The horror of her disappearance and death became not just a tragedy for her family and fiancé, but a wound for an entire academic community. Annie had walked into the lab with dreams of healing the world. She never walked out. The discovery of Annie Lee's body on September 13, 2009, shattered not only her family and fiancé, but also the broader Yale community. What had begun as the disappearance of a promising graduate student days before her wedding had spiraled into a nightmare of betrayal and violence within the walls of one of America's most prestigious universities. And almost immediately after her body was found, investigators turned their attention to a young man who had slipped under the radar until then. Raymond Clark III. Clark was 24, only a few months older than Annie, and worked as an animal lab technician. At Yale, his job was unglamorous but essential: feeding, cleaning, and monitoring the mice used in biomedical research. Technicians like him were often invisible to graduate students and professors, a background presence keeping the machinery of research running smoothly. Outwardly, Clark was unremarkable. He lived in Middletown, Connecticut, with his fiancée, Jennifer Hermadka, and appeared to be a steady, if quiet, man. But those who knew him more closely described something different: a controlling streak, an obsession with rules, a temper that simmered beneath the surface. In the days leading up to Annie's disappearance, Clark had been assigned to the same research facility where she worked. On September 8th, his keycard activity raised red flags. It placed him in multiple rooms near where Annie's body was eventually discovered. Even more damning, his card logs showed movements that aligned with gaps in Annie's recorded presence, suggesting he was shadowing her. Investigators noted the precision. He wasn't just wandering. He was moving deliberately, as though tracking her. Forensic evidence began to pile up quickly. Swabs taken from the crime scene revealed traces of DNA, skin cells, and biological material that matched Clark. Items in the mechanical room where Annie's body was hidden carried his genetic fingerprints. Even on Annie's clothing, DNA evidence tied him to the crime. The probability of coincidence was astronomical. The science, ironically, sealed the fate of a man working in a place devoted to science. As detectives interviewed colleagues, more troubling details emerged about Clark's behavior. He was described as a control freak, someone who enforced lab rules with unnecessary aggression. He scolded graduate students, nitpicked procedures, and treated minor infractions as personal offenses. Female colleagues recalled feeling uneasy around him, noting that he sometimes lingered too close, made them uncomfortable, or seemed overly invested in controlling their movements within the lab. What once had been dismissed as eccentricity now took on a sinister hue. On September 17, 2009, just days after Annie's body was found, police moved in. In a dramatic scene outside his apartment in Middletown, Clark was arrested, led away in handcuffs as neighbors and reporters watched. He was charged with Annie's murder. The evidence was overwhelming, the motive less clear but chilling in its simplicity. Investigators believed he had confronted Annie over lab procedures, escalated into violence, and strangled her. Whether it was premeditated or a sudden eruption of rage remained debated, but the result was the same. For Annie's family, the arrest was both relief and renewed pain. They had their answer, but the truth did nothing to soften the blow of her absence. Her parents wept as they spoke to the press, their words heavy with loss. Her brother described her as the light of our family, extinguished by senseless violence. For Jonathan, the fiancé who had been preparing to marry her on the very day her body was discovered, The grief was unspeakable. He retreated into silence, supported by friends but hollowed by the loss of the future he and Annie had planned. The case moved slowly through the courts. Clark initially pled not guilty, but the evidence against him was insurmountable. In March 2011, facing the likelihood of a trial that would end in conviction and possibly the death penalty, he accepted a plea deal. He pled guilty to murder and was sentenced to 44 years in prison with no possibility of parole. The sentence meant he would be in his late 60s by the time he was released, effectively ensuring he would live most of his life behind bars. During sentencing, Annie's family members spoke of their grief. Her mother's voice broke as she described the pain of losing her daughter, the daughter who had carried the dreams of their immigrant journey, who had promised to cure diseases and build a family of her own. Jonathan did not speak publicly, but his absence was felt. The silence of a man robbed of the love of his life, a groom left without a bride. The courtroom was heavy with emotion, a stark reminder that justice, while necessary, could never restore what had been stolen. Clark himself apologized briefly, but his words rang hollow. To those present, he seemed less remorseful than resigned. A man who had destroyed multiple lives with an act of violence he never fully explained. His fiancée, Jennifer, ended her engagement with him, her own life upended by the revelation of his brutality. The man she thought she knew had turned out to be a killer, and she, like so many others, was left to grapple with the betrayal in the aftermath. Yale grappled with the scar left by Annie's murder. Vigils were held on campus, professors and students speaking tearfully of her brilliance, her warmth, her potential. The university promised reviews of lab security, acknowledging that while Clark had been an employee, the systems meant to protect students had failed in the most devastating way. Annie's name was etched into the memory of Yale, a reminder of vulnerability even in places of supposed safety. Her family created scholarships in her honor, determined to ensure that her legacy would not be defined solely by her death, but also by the promise of her life. At Cornell and Yale, professors spoke of her research, her diligence, the brilliance that might have led to breakthroughs in cancer treatment. She would never publish those discoveries, never walk down the aisle in her white gown, never laugh with her children. But those who knew her carried her memory as both inspiration and warning. The murder of Annie Lou remains one of the most haunting crimes in recent American history because of its layers of irony and tragedy. She was days away from her wedding, a young scientist on the cusp of a bright future, killed not by a stranger in the shadows, but by a coworker inside the very walls she trusted. Her disappearance had gripped the nation, her discovery devastated it, and her killer's guilty plea closed the case without ever fully answering the question of why. Today, Raymond Clark sits in prison, serving out his decades-long sentence. Annie's family continues to mourn. Her fiancé lives with the ache of what might have been, and Yale remembers the promising student whose name became synonymous with both brilliance and tragedy. Annie Lee's story endures because it is more than a crime. It is a reminder of the fragility of life, of how quickly dreams can be stolen, of the darkness that can lurk even in places of learning and light. Her life was a testament to resilience, brilliance, and love. Her death was a tragedy that will never be forgotten.